The crackling sound of burning timber was the last thing Beatrice Grantham heard before the roof beam collapsed behind her, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky as she plunged barefoot into the knee-deep snow. The winter of 1884 had been merciless in the mountains near Walla Walla, Washington, and tonight it seemed determined to claim her life one way or another. She had been asleep when the lantern fell, knocked over by winds that screamed through every crack in the cabin walls, and by the time she smelled the smoke, flames were already consuming the kitchen. There had been no time to grab boots, no time to think about a coat or supplies. She had only seconds to choose between burning alive or facing the blizzard that raged outside with a fury she had never witnessed in her 22 years of life. Beatrice ran. She did not know where she was going, could not see more than a few feet ahead through the swirling white chaos that engulfed her. The snow stung her face like 1,000 tiny knives, and the wind tore at her nightgown until she thought it might rip the thin fabric from her body entirely. Behind her, the cabin that had been her home for 3 lonely months lit up the darkness like a beacon, but she could not look back. Looking back meant stopping, and stopping meant death. Her feet were already numb, her lungs burning from the frigid air. She gulped down with each desperate breath. She had no idea how far she had stumbled from the burning wreckage when her legs finally gave out beneath her. One moment she was pushing forward through the drifts, and the next she was on her hands and knees, screaming into the wind because screaming was all she had left. The sound that came from her throat was raw and primal, a cry of terror and rage against the injustice of surviving a fire only to freeze to death in the snow. She had come west with her father 6 months ago, seeking a new beginning after her mother's death from consumption. They were going to start a cattle ranch, he had promised, make a fortune in this wild territory where opportunity beckoned to anyone brave enough to seize it. But her father had died of a heart attack 2 months after they arrived, leaving Beatrice alone in a cabin 20 miles from the nearest settlement with winter approaching fast. She had tried to make it work, had trapped rabbits and melted snow for water, and told herself that spring would come and everything would be better. Now spring seemed as distant as the moon, and the cold was seeping into her bones with fingers that would not be denied. She screamed again, though she knew no one could hear her over the howling wind. Her voice was growing weaker, her body beginning to shut down as hypothermia claimed her inch by inch. This was how she would die, she thought with strange clarity, alone in the snow, 22 years old. And no one would even know to look for her until the spring thaw revealed her frozen corpse. The thought made her angry enough to try crawling forward one more time, but her arms would not support her weight anymore. She collapsed face first into the snow, and the cold felt almost warm against her burning skin. That was how freezing to death worked. She remembered hearing once. First you felt cold, then you felt warm, and then you felt nothing at all. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the storm like thunder, so unexpected that at first Beatrice thought she was hallucinating. But then a horse whinnied somewhere close by, and a man's voice shouted words she could not make out over the wind. She tried to lift her head, tried to scream again, but only a weak moan escaped her lips. Strong hands grabbed her shoulders and rolled her over, and through the haze of snow and darkness, she saw a face looking down at her. The man had ice in his beard and concern in his eyes that were barely visible beneath the brim of his hat. "Good God, woman, what are you doing out here?" His voice was deep and rough, edged with panic as he stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shaking body. "Can you hear me? Say something if you can hear me." Beatrice tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too violently to form words. The man cursed under his breath and scooped her up as though she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest as he turned back toward his horse. The animal was a massive bay gelding that stood steady despite the storm, its eyes rolling white with fear, but its feet planted firm. The man managed to get into the saddle while holding Beatrice, settling her across his lap like a child as he urged the horse forward into the blizzard. "There's a line shack about a mile from here," he said, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him. "You just hold on, you understand? You hold on, and I will get you somewhere warm." Beatrice wanted to tell him about the fire, about her cabin burning, and everything she owned going up in flames, but the words would not come. She buried her face against his chest and felt the steady thump of his heartbeat through the layers of his shirt. He was warm, so impossibly warm, and she pressed closer to that warmth like a moth to flame. The ride seemed to last forever, and no time at all. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the motion of the horse and the iron band, of the man's arm holding her secure against him. When the horse finally stopped, she was too weak to lift her head. The man dismounted and carried her through a door that he kicked open with his boot. Inside was dark and cold, but at least the wind could not reach them here. He laid her down on something soft, and she heard him moving around the small space with purpose. A match flared, and then lantern light pushed back the darkness. She caught a glimpse of rough wooden walls and a pot-bellied stove before the man blocked her view, kneeling beside her with blankets in his hands. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, his tone businesslike but gentle. "You will die if we do not get you warm, and I am not going to let that happen. Do you understand?" Beatrice managed a tiny nod. She did not care about modesty anymore, did not care about anything except the cold that had settled into her marrow. The man worked quickly and efficiently, stripping away her soaked nightgown and rubbing her skin with rough wool blankets until friction brought a faint tingle of feeling back to her limbs. He wrapped her in dry blankets and moved to the stove, where he was soon coaxing a fire to life with kindling and split logs that had been stored in a box beside it. The small cabin began to warm, and Beatrice felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness again, this time not from cold, but from exhaustion so profound she could not fight it. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the single window of the line shack, so bright against the snow outside that it hurt her eyes. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white silence. Beatrice lay still for a moment, trying to remember where she was and how she had gotten here. The memories came back in fragments: the fire, the blizzard, the stranger on horseback. She turned her head and saw him sitting in a chair near the stove, his head tilted back against the wall and his eyes closed. In the daylight, she could see him clearly for the first time, and she found herself staring despite her weakness. He looked to be in his late 20s with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that was more stubble than proper growth. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with the kind of lines that came from squinting at distant horizons and facing down trouble without flinching. He was lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living, all muscle and sinew with no softness anywhere. His clothes were those of a working cowboy: denim trousers worn thin at the knees, a flannel shirt beneath a leather vest, and boots that had seen better days. A gun belt hung over the back of his chair, the holster positioned for an easy draw. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened. They were gray as a winter sky, and they studied her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her situation. She was naked beneath the blankets, in a tiny cabin with a man she did not know, miles from anywhere. Her heart began to pound, and she must have let some of her fear show on her face, because his expression softened immediately. "You are safe," he said quietly. "I mean you no harm, I promise you that. My name is Harrison Yates, and I work for the Triple Bar Ranch about 15 miles south of here. I was checking the northern fence line when I saw the glow of your fire through the storm. By the time I got close enough to investigate, the whole structure was coming down. I was riding back to tell the foreman about it when I heard you screaming." He paused, then added, "I thought you were an animal at first, caught in a trap maybe. I have never been so glad to be wrong." Beatrice swallowed hard, her throat raw from screaming and smoke inhalation. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved my life." Harrison shook his head. "Thank me when we get you back to the ranch and make sure you are truly all right. You were nearly frozen when I found you. Can you tell me your name?" "Beatrice Grantham. That was my cabin that burned. I have been living there since my father died." The words came easier now, though her voice still sounded strange to her own ears. "We came out from Missouri last summer. He wanted to start a ranch." Something flickered in Harrison's eyes, an emotion she could not quite name. "You have been alone out there since your father passed?" She nodded, feeling tears sting her eyes and hating herself for the weakness. "I did not have money to go back east, and I thought I could manage until spring. I was doing all right until last night." Harrison stood and moved to the stove, where he poured something from a battered coffee pot into a tin cup. He brought it to her, helping her sit up enough to drink without spilling. The coffee was bitter and strong, but it was hot, and Beatrice felt it spread warmth through her chest and belly. She drank gratefully, not caring that it burned her tongue. "When you finish that, I am going to need to check your feet and hands," Harrison said, settling back in his chair. "Frostbite can set in fast in weather like we had last night, and if it has, we need to know sooner rather than later." The thought of losing fingers or toes to frostbite filled Beatrice with fresh terror, but she forced herself to stay calm as she drained the cup. Harrison took it from her and knelt beside the bedroll, gently pulling her hands free of the blankets. He examined each finger carefully, his touch surprisingly gentle for someone with such rough, work-hardened hands. After a moment, he nodded, seeming satisfied with what he saw. "These look all right. Red and swollen, but that is just the blood coming back. The real test is your feet." He moved to the end of the bedroll and uncovered her feet with the same clinical detachment he had shown with her hands. Beatrice watched his face anxiously, trying to read his expression. Her feet felt like they belonged to someone else, swollen and painful and covered in angry red patches that made her stomach turn. But Harrison's expression remained neutral as he probed each toe carefully. "You are lucky," he said finally, covering her feet again and meeting her eyes. "No frostbite that I can see. You are going to be sore for a few days, and you need to keep warm and dry, but you will heal. Another 10 minutes in that storm, and I would be telling you a different story." The relief that washed through Beatrice was so intense she started crying, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Harrison looked alarmed, clearly unsure what to do with a weeping woman in his care. He settled for awkwardly patting her shoulder and murmuring that everything was going to be all right now. She was safe, no need to cry. But Beatrice could not stop. She cried for her father, for her lost home, for the terror of the night before, and the realization of how close she had come to death. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she lay exhausted and ashamed beneath the blankets, while Harrison pretended to be very interested in stoking the fire. "I am sorry," she said finally, when she could speak again. "I do not usually fall apart like that." "You have earned the right to fall apart a little," Harrison said without looking at her. "I would be worried about you if you were not shaken up after what you went through. But you are alive, and that is what matters. Everything else can be figured out." Beatrice wanted to ask what he meant by that. What exactly could be figured out when she had lost everything she owned and had nowhere to go? But before she could form the question, Harrison stood and reached for his coat. "I need to go take care of my horse. He stood out in that storm for hours last night, and he deserves better treatment than I have given him so far. There is more coffee on the stove, and some jerky in my saddlebag if you are hungry. Your clothes were too far gone to save, but I will see what I can find for you to wear. This shack is used by line riders from the Triple Bar, so there should be spare gear around here somewhere." He was gone before Beatrice could thank him again, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She lay still for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of Harrison moving around outside. Eventually, she forced herself to sit up, keeping the blankets wrapped tight around her body. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, containing little more than the bedroll she was lying on, the pot-bellied stove, a rough table with 2 chairs, and some shelves that held basic supplies. Everything was clean and orderly despite the rustic conditions, suggesting that whoever maintained this line shack took pride in their work. Beatrice made her way unsteadily to the stove and poured herself another cup of coffee. Her whole body ached, and her feet protested every step, but it felt good to be moving again. She found Harrison's saddlebag hanging from a peg near the door and dug out the jerky he had mentioned. It was tough and salty, but she was so hungry she could have eaten shoe leather and been grateful for it. She was chewing slowly, savoring each bite when the door opened and Harrison came back inside, carrying an armload of clothes. "Found these in the storage chest," he said, averting his eyes as he set the bundle on the table. "They are going to be too big for you, but they are clean and dry. There are even some long underwear that might help keep you warm. I will wait outside while you dress." He was gone again before Beatrice could respond, and she found herself smiling despite everything. Harrison Yates was clearly a man more comfortable with horses and cattle than with women, and his obvious discomfort with the situation was oddly endearing. She set down her coffee and sorted through the clothes he had brought. As promised, everything was far too large, but she was in no position to be particular about fit. The long underwear hung loose on her frame, and she had to roll the sleeves and cuffs several times. The shirt was made for a man twice her size, and the trousers required a belt cinched tight to keep them from falling down. But they were warm and dry, and that was all that mattered. When she was dressed, she called out to Harrison that he could come back inside. He entered cautiously, as if afraid she might have changed her mind about modesty. His eyes swept over her once, and something that might have been amusement touched his mouth. "You look like a child playing dress up in her father's clothes," he said. Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she lifted her chin. "I am grateful for the clothes, no matter how ridiculous I look in them. It beats freezing to death." "That it does," Harrison agreed. He moved to the table and sat down, gesturing for her to join him. "We need to talk about what happens next. The storm has passed, but there will be more before winter is through. You cannot stay out here alone, and from what you have told me, you have nothing to go back to even if your cabin was still standing." Beatrice sank into the other chair, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth. "I know, I have been trying not to think about it." "The way I see it, you have two choices," Harrison continued. "I can take you into Walla Walla. It is about a day's ride from here, weather permitting. You could find work there, maybe as a cook or a laundress. It is not easy work, and the pay is not much, but it would be a roof over your head." He paused, studying her face. "Or you could come back to the Triple Bar with me. The ranch house is big, and the foreman's wife is always looking for help with the household. She would give you room and board in exchange for work, and it would be safer than being alone in town." Beatrice considered the options, trying to think clearly despite her exhaustion. Walla Walla was a real town with shops and churches and law. There would be other women there, a community she could become part of. But the thought of being alone again, even surrounded by people, made her chest tight with anxiety. The alternative was going to a ranch where she would know no one except Harrison, working for strangers who might not want her there. But something about the way Harrison spoke of the place, the quiet confidence in his voice when he mentioned the foreman's wife, made her trust him. "I would like to go to the Triple Bar," she said, "if you truly think they would have me." Harrison nodded as if he had expected that answer. "They will have you. Sarah Yates is a good woman, and she will not turn away someone in need. She is my brother's wife," he added, seeing the question in Beatrice's eyes. "Thomas is the foreman I mentioned. They have 3 children and a house that always seems too small for all the noise they make. You would fit right in." The warmth in his voice when he spoke of his family surprised Beatrice. This taciturn cowboy who seemed so uncomfortable with emotion clearly loved his brother and his family deeply. She found herself wondering what it would be like to be part of such a household, to have that sense of belonging again. She had not realized how desperately lonely she had been until this moment, sitting across from a stranger who had shown her more kindness in one night than she had experienced in months. "When can we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, if you are strong enough. The temperature has dropped, but the sky is clear, and we should make good time if the weather holds. I need to finish checking the fence line today, but I can do that while you rest. You should sleep as much as you can. The ride will be hard on you, given what you have been through." Beatrice wanted to protest that she did not need to be coddled, that she was stronger than she looked. But even sitting upright was taking more effort than it should, and she knew Harrison was right. She needed rest if she was going to survive a day's journey in the cold. She nodded and let him help her back to the bedroll, where she curled up beneath the blankets and closed her eyes. She heard Harrison moving around the cabin, gathering his gear and preparing to head back out into the cold. Just before he left, she heard him add more wood to the stove, and the gesture touched her more than she could have expressed. She slept through most of the day, waking only when Harrison returned in the late afternoon with fresh snow on his shoulders and cold radiating from his clothes. He had brought back a rabbit he had shot, and he skinned and dressed it with the practiced ease of someone who had performed the task 1,000 times. Soon the smell of roasting meat filled the cabin, and Beatrice's stomach growled loud enough that Harrison actually smiled. "Hungry?" he asked unnecessarily. "Starving," she admitted. "I cannot remember the last time I ate a proper meal." Harrison's smile faded, replaced by concern. "You really were on your own out there, were you not? No neighbors checking on you? No one bringing supplies?" "The nearest homestead is 10 miles away, and they have their own struggles. I did not want to be a burden." Beatrice pushed herself up to sitting, accepting the plate Harrison handed her. The rabbit was simple, just meat roasted over the fire with a little salt, but it tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to wolf it down despite her hunger. They ate in companionable silence, and when the meal was finished, Harrison cleaned the dishes with snow melted in a pot on the stove. Beatrice watched him work, noticing things about him she had been too dazed to see before. The way his hands moved with confidence and economy, never wasting motion. The set of his shoulders, strong but not arrogant. The quiet competence that radiated from him. The sense that here was a man who could handle whatever the world threw at him without complaint or drama. "You are staring," Harrison said without turning around. Beatrice felt her cheeks heat. "I apologize. I was just thinking that I do not know anything about you except your name and that you work for the Triple Bar." Harrison dried his hands on a rag and turned to face her. "Not much to know, really. I have been cowboying since I was 15, worked ranches all over Wyoming and Montana before settling here in Washington Territory 3 years ago. My brother heard the Triple Bar was hiring and convinced me to come west with him. It is good land, good people. I have no complaints." "You never wanted to have your own place?" Beatrice asked. "Most men who work cattle dream of having their own spread someday." Something flickered across Harrison's face, gone too quickly for her to identify. "Maybe once, but ranching takes money I do not have and probably never will. I am content working for someone else, knowing my responsibilities end when my shift does. It is a simpler life." Beatrice sensed there was more to the story, but she did not press. She had her own secrets, her own reasons for leaving Missouri that had nothing to do with her father's dream of a ranch. They all carried burdens out here in the wilderness, and sometimes the kindest thing you could do was not ask questions. As darkness fell, they settled in for the night. Harrison insisted Beatrice take the bedroll while he made do with blankets on the floor near the stove. She wanted to argue that he had already given up his coat and spent the previous night keeping watch over her, that he deserved the more comfortable sleeping arrangement. But exhaustion was pulling at her again, and she did not have the energy to fight. She fell asleep listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of Harrison's steady breathing, feeling safer than she had in longer than she could remember. Morning came cold and clear, with sunlight glittering off the snow like diamonds scattered across white velvet. Beatrice woke to find Harrison already up, saddling his horse outside. She dressed quickly in the oversized clothes and joined him, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The bay gelding watched her approach with mild curiosity, and Harrison glanced over at the sound of her footsteps crunching through the snow. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Sore, but all right," Beatrice said honestly. "Ready to go." Harrison nodded and finished cinching the saddle. "It is going to be a long ride, and we will have to share the horse. Storm is strong, but I do not want to push him too hard, carrying double in these conditions. We will take it slow and stop to rest when we need to. You tell me if you start feeling faint or too cold. Understood. Understood, Beatrice agreed. Harrison mounted first, then reached down to pull her up behind him. She settled awkwardly onto the horse's rump, having to grip Harrison's waist to keep from sliding off. It felt strange and intimate to be pressed against him this way, her arms wrapped around a man she barely knew. But Harrison seemed unbothered by the arrangement, or at least he gave no sign of discomfort as he urged Storm forward into the snow. The landscape that unfolded around them was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly hostile. Snow stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the dark lines of fence posts and the occasional stand of evergreens bent under the weight of ice. The sun was bright but gave no warmth, and the wind that swept across the open prairie cut through Beatrice's borrowed clothes like they were made of paper. She pressed closer to Harrison, drawing what warmth she could from his body, and felt his arm shift to hold her more securely. They rode for hours, stopping occasionally to let Storm rest and to give Beatrice a chance to walk around and restore circulation to her legs. Harrison shared his canteen and the last of his jerky, insisting she eat most of it despite her protests. As the day wore on, they talked in fits and starts, their words punctuated by long silences that were not uncomfortable. Harrison told her about the triple bar, about the thousands of acres of grassland that supported hundreds of head of cattle, about the hard work of keeping the ranch running through brutal winters and scorching summers. Beatrice found herself telling him about her life in Missouri, about her mother's long illness and her father's grief, about the desperation that had driven them west in search of something better. "Do you regret coming?" Harrison asked as they paused on a ridge overlooking a vast white valley. Beatrice considered the question carefully. "I regret that my father died before he could see his dream realized. I regret being alone and afraid. But I do not regret leaving Missouri. There was nothing for me there except memories and a house full of ghosts. At least here I have a chance to build something new, even if I have to start from nothing." Harrison turned his head to look at her, and there was something in his gray eyes that made her heart skip. "You are braver than you think. Or more foolish," Beatrice said, but she smiled as she said it. They reached the triple bar as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. The ranch was larger than Beatrice had imagined, with a sprawling main house, several barns and outbuildings, and a network of corrals that must have held dozens of horses. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and the warm glow of lamplight spilled from windows, creating an oasis of civilization in the frozen wilderness. Harrison guided Storm toward the main house, where a woman appeared on the porch before they had even dismounted. "Harrison Yates, where have you been?" the woman called, her voice carrying a note of worry beneath the scolding tone. "Thomas said you should have been back yesterday, and I have been beside myself thinking you froze to death or got trampled by an ornery bull or God knows what." "I am fine, Sarah," Harrison said, swinging down from the saddle. He reached up to help Beatrice dismount, and she felt every muscle in her body protest as her feet hit the ground. "I had some unexpected complications on the fence line, but nothing I could not handle. Is Thomas around?" Sarah Yates came down the porch steps, and in the fading light, Beatrice could see she was a handsome woman in her early 30s with red hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent green eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes fixed on Beatrice now, taking in her oversized clothes and exhausted face with a single sweep. "Who is this?" Sarah asked, but her tone had already shifted from worried to welcoming. "This is Beatrice Grantham. Her cabin burned down 2 nights ago during the blizzard. I found her in the snow and brought her to the line shack until it was safe to travel. She needs a place to stay and work if you have it for her." Harrison delivered the facts in his typical straightforward manner, but Beatrice noticed he did not mention exactly how close to death she had been when he found her. Sarah's expression softened immediately, and she moved forward to take Beatrice's cold hands in her own warm ones. You poor dear. Come inside right now before you catch your death out here. Harrison, you take care of that horse and then get yourself inside too. I want to hear the whole story, and I will not have either of you freezing while you tell it. She tugged Beatrice toward the house with gentle insistence, and Beatrice went gratefully. The warmth that enveloped her when they stepped inside was almost overwhelming after the hours in the cold. The main house was large and comfortable, furnished with sturdy handmade furniture and decorated with the kind of homey touches that spoke of a woman's care. Children's voices echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, and the smell of cooking food made Beatrice's mouth water. Sarah led her to a chair near the kitchen stove and pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. Now, you sit there and warm up while I get some proper clothes together for you. You look half drowned in that get-up Harrison must have found for you. We are about the same size, and I have dresses I do not wear anymore. You can have them with my blessing. I could not, Beatrice began, but Sarah waved away her protest. Nonsense. What good are clothes sitting in a trunk when someone needs them? You just rest and drink that tea. Harrison will tell me what happened when he comes in, and then we will figure out what is to be done. True to her word, when Harrison appeared a few minutes later, Sarah sat him down with his own cup of tea and extracted the story from him with the kind of gentle persistence Beatrice suspected worked on everyone, from stubborn cowboys to recalcitrant children. Harrison told it simply, leaving out nothing but also not dwelling on the drama of the rescue. Beatrice watched Sarah's face as she listened, seeing the concern there and something else, a measuring look she could not quite interpret. When Harrison finished, Sarah stood and put her hands on her hips. Well, it is settled then. Beatrice will stay here with us. Lord knows I could use help with the house and the children, and Thomas is always going on about how we should hire more staff now that the ranch is doing so well. You will earn your keep, dear, but you will also be part of this family. That is how we do things at the Triple Bar. Everyone pulls their weight, and everyone looks out for each other. Does that sound acceptable to you? Beatrice felt tears sting her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. More than acceptable. I cannot thank you enough for taking me in like this. No thanks necessary. Harrison saved your life, which makes you his responsibility, and what is his responsibility is ours. Now come with me, and let us get you into some proper clothes and a hot bath. You look like you have been through hell and back. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as Beatrice settled into life at the Triple Bar. Sarah proved to be as warm and generous as she had seemed that first night, welcoming Beatrice not just as hired help, but as a member of the household. The work was hard, but satisfying. Cooking and cleaning, helping with the children, mending clothes, and tending the kitchen garden that lay dormant beneath the snow. Beatrice threw herself into the tasks with determination, grateful to have purpose again and people who depended on her. The children were a revelation. 10-year-old Matthew was serious and thoughtful like his father, always underfoot asking questions about everything from how bread rose to why the sky was blue. 8-year-old Emma was full of energy and mischief, a whirlwind of freckles and red braids who reminded Beatrice of what she herself might have been like at that age if life had been less difficult. The baby, 4-year-old Daniel, was shy at first but quickly warmed to Beatrice, following her around the house and insisting she read him stories before bed. Thomas Yates, the foreman and Sarah's husband, was an older version of Harrison with the same gray eyes and dark hair, though his was starting to show threads of silver at the temples. He was quieter than his wife, more reserved, but Beatrice could see the deep love between them in every glance and gesture. He treated Beatrice with polite respect, clearly grateful for the help she provided Sarah, but also protective of his family in a way that made her feel safe rather than unwelcome. And then there was Harrison. In the close quarters of ranch life, Beatrice saw him nearly every day. He took his meals with the family, worked from dawn to dusk alongside the other cowboys, and spent his evenings helping with whatever needed doing around the house. Beatrice found herself watching for him without quite meaning to, her pulse quickening when she heard his footsteps on the porch or his voice talking to his brother in the yard. She told herself it was simple gratitude, that anyone would feel drawn to the person who had saved their life. But she knew in her heart it was something more. Harrison seemed to feel the pull between them too, though he was careful to maintain a respectful distance. He spoke to her kindly when they crossed paths, asked how she was settling in, made sure she had everything she needed. But there was a wariness in his manner, as if he were afraid to let himself get too close. Beatrice did not understand it at first, this hot and cold behavior that left her confused and a little hurt. It was Sarah who finally explained it to her one evening as they sat together mending socks by the fire. Harrison is gun-shy about women, Sarah said without preamble. He was engaged once, about 5 years ago when he was working a ranch in Montana. Pretty little thing, daughter of the ranch owner. Harrison was so in love with her he could barely see straight. They were supposed to get married in the spring, but a month before the wedding she ran off with a traveling salesman. Left Harrison a note saying she could not face a life of hard work and poverty, that she wanted more than what a cowboy could give her. It about broke him. Beatrice felt her heart ache for the pain Harrison must have suffered. That is terrible. It is, Sarah agreed. And the worst part is, I think he still believes she was right, that he does not have enough to offer a woman, that anyone who got close to him would eventually leave for something better. Thomas has tried talking sense into him, but Harrison is stubborn as a mule when he gets an idea in his head, so he keeps to himself and does not let anyone get close enough to hurt him again. The insight helped Beatrice understand Harrison's behavior, but it also filled her with frustration. She wanted to tell him that she did not care about money or status, that she knew what it was like to have everything and what it was like to have nothing, and she would take a good man with a kind heart over wealth and position any day. But she could not find the words or the right moment to say them, and so she kept her feelings locked away and tried to be content with the friendship Harrison was willing to offer. Winter deepened its grip on the land, and the work of keeping the ranch running became even more demanding. Cattle had to be fed and watered, ice broken on frozen troughs, animals checked constantly for signs of illness or injury. The cowboys worked in brutal conditions, and more than once someone came back to the main house with frostbitten fingers or faces raw from windburn. Beatrice found herself helping Sarah tend to these minor injuries, learning how to treat frostbite and wrap bandages and brew the special teas Sarah swore prevented lung ailments. It was during one of these brutal cold snaps that disaster struck. Thomas and Harrison had ridden out with two other cowboys to check on a herd in the north pasture, and when they did not return by nightfall, Sarah's worry was palpable. The temperature was dropping fast, and the sky had the leaden look that promised more snow. Beatrice helped her prepare food and coffee to stay hot on the stove, both of them jumping at every sound that might herald the men's return. They finally arrived near midnight, and Beatrice knew something was wrong the moment she saw Harrison's face. He was supporting Thomas, who was limping badly, and both men looked exhausted. Sarah rushed to her husband while Beatrice hurried to help Harrison ease Thomas into a chair. The foreman's face was gray with pain, and when Sarah pulled up his pant leg, Beatrice saw his ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. "Horse stepped in a hole and went down," Thomas said through gritted teeth. "My leg got pinned underneath. Harrison got me out, but I think the ankle might be broken." Sarah's hands were gentle but efficient as she examined the injury. "Not broken, I do not think, but badly sprained. You will be off your feet for at least 2 weeks, Thomas Yates, and do not argue with me about it." Thomas started to protest, but Harrison cut him off. "She is right, and you know it. I can handle the day-to-day operations while you rest. The boys know their jobs, and we will manage just fine." Over the next 2 weeks, Harrison proved his words true. He took on Thomas's responsibilities in addition to his own, working longer hours than anyone should have to work and somehow still finding time to check in on his brother. Beatrice saw the toll it took on him, the exhaustion that lined his face and the weight of responsibility that settled on his shoulders. She wanted to help somehow, but she did not know what she could do beyond ensuring he had hot meals and coffee waiting when he came in from the cold. One evening she found him in the barn. sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands. She almost turned away, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a private moment, but something made her step forward instead. "Harrison," she said softly. He looked up, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. "I am sorry. I just needed a minute away from everyone. It has been a long few days." Beatrice sat down beside him, careful to leave a respectable distance between them. "You do not need to apologize. You have been doing the work of 3 men. Anyone would need a break." Harrison let out a harsh laugh. "Thomas never seems to need a break. He handles all of this and more without breaking a sweat. I do not know how he does it." "Thomas has been doing it for years," Beatrice pointed out. "You have only been at it for 2 weeks. Give yourself some credit." Harrison turned to look at her, and in the dim light of the barn, his face was all shadows and plains. "You have been here almost a month now. Are you settling in all right? Sarah has not been working you too hard?" "Sarah has been wonderful, and the work is exactly what I need. I feel useful again, like I have a purpose. I have you to thank for that." Beatrice paused, then added, "I never properly thanked you for saving my life. I do not think I even can. How do you thank someone for something like that? You do not need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same." Harrison's voice was gruff, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "That is not true, and you know it. A lot of men would have ridden past that fire without investigating. A lot of men would have left me in the snow rather than risk their own safety in a blizzard. But you did not. You risked everything to save a stranger, and I will never forget that." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I could not leave you. When I heard you screaming, something in me just knew I had to find you, had to help you. I did not think about the risk or whether it was smart. I just acted." Beatrice felt her heart pound in her chest. The space between them seemed to shrink, and she was acutely aware of the warmth of his body next to hers, the way his shoulder almost but not quite touched her own. She wanted to close that gap, to reach for him and tell him everything she had been feeling for weeks now. But Harrison stood abruptly, breaking the moment before it could fully form. "I should get back to the house. Sarah will be wondering where I am, and I still need to go over the supply lists for next week's trip into town." He did not quite meet her eyes as he spoke, and Beatrice knew he was running from whatever had almost happened between them. She stood too, fighting down her disappointment. "Of course. I will walk back with you." They made their way through the cold in silence, the moment in the barn already feeling like something Beatrice might have imagined. But when they reached the house and Harrison held the door open for her, their hands brushed and she felt the spark of connection jump between them like static electricity. Harrison felt it too. She saw it in the way his eyes widened and his breath caught. But he said nothing, just nodded goodnight and disappeared into the room he shared with 2 other cowboys, leaving Beatrice standing in the hallway, wondering if she would ever understand him. Spring came slowly to Washington Territory, creeping north in fits and starts as the days lengthened and the snow began to melt. The ranch came alive with new activity as calves were born and the herds were driven to fresh pastures. Beatrice had been at the Triple Bar for 3 months now, and she could not imagine being anywhere else. This place and these people had become her family in a way that felt more real than any blood tie. Her feelings for Harrison had only grown stronger with time, until she could no longer deny that she had fallen in love with him. She loved his quiet strength, his sense of honor, the way he was patient with the children and kind to the animals. She loved how hard he worked and how he never complained, even when he was exhausted. She loved the rare smile that transformed his serious face and the even rarer laugh that made her heart soar. But she kept these feelings to herself, locked away where they could not hurt her, because it was clear Harrison did not want her love. Or so she thought, until the day everything changed. It was a warm afternoon in late April, and Beatrice had taken a basket of mending out to the porch to work in the sunshine. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter ringing out across the ranch, and she felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, this sense of home and belonging. She was so lost in her thoughts that she did not notice Harrison approaching until he spoke. "Beatrice, can I talk to you for a minute?" She looked up to find him standing at the base of the porch steps, his hat in his hands and an expression on his face she could not read. "Of course, is something wrong?" "No. Maybe. I do not know." Harrison climbed the steps and sat down in the chair beside hers, turning it so he faced her rather than the yard. "I have been trying to figure out how to say this for weeks now, and I still do not have the right words, so I am just going to say it plain and hope you do not think I am a complete fool." Beatrice set down her mending, her heart starting to race. "All right." Harrison took a deep breath and met her eyes. "I have feelings for you. Strong feelings. I tried to ignore them, tried to tell myself it was just because I felt responsible for you after the rescue. But it is more than that, so much more. I think about you constantly. When I am out working the herd, I am wondering what you are doing. When I come back to the house at night, you are the first person I look for. And when you smile at me, it feels like the sun breaking through clouds. I am falling in love with you, Beatrice, and it terrifies me." The words hung between them, raw and honest, and Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I have nothing to offer you. I am just a cowboy with a few dollars saved and no prospects for anything better. You deserve someone who can give you security, a home of your own, a future that does not involve scraping by season to season. I swore I would not do this again, would not let myself care for someone who would eventually realize I am not enough. But I cannot seem to help myself where you are concerned." Beatrice reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm and the strength in his fingers. "Harrison, look at me. Really look at me." She waited until his eyes met hers. "Do you know what I had before I came here? Nothing. Less than nothing. I was alone and terrified, and so desperate I was willing to die in that cabin rather than admit I could not make it on my own. You did not just save my life that night. You gave me a reason to live again. You brought me here, to this place and these people, and you gave me a family. How can you think that is not enough?" "But you could do better," Harrison insisted. "In town there are merchants and businessmen who would court you properly, who could give you things I never could." "I do not want merchants or businessmen," Beatrice said fiercely. "I want you. I have been in love with you for weeks, maybe since that first night when you wrapped me in your coat and refused to let me die. I love your kindness and your strength and your stubbornness. I love the way you care for your family and the way you work yourself to exhaustion without complaint. I love everything about you, Harrison Yates, and if you think I am the kind of woman who cares more about money than the man I love, then you do not know me at all." Harrison stared at her as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Then slowly, carefully, he raised his free hand to cup her cheek. "Say it again." "I love you," Beatrice whispered. "I love you." Harrison pulled her toward him, and their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and desperate, filled with weeks of longing finally unleashed. Beatrice's hands came up to grip his shoulders, and she poured everything she felt into that kiss, every ounce of love and need and hope. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Harrison's eyes were bright with emotion. "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know I should court you properly and wait a respectable amount of time, but I do not want to wait. I have wasted enough time being afraid. Marry me, Beatrice. Let me spend the rest of my life proving I am worthy of you." Beatrice laughed through her tears. You already proved that when you rode into a blizzard to save me. Yes, Harrison, yes, I will marry you. He kissed her again, and this time when they broke apart, he was smiling with a joy so pure it transformed his entire face. In the yard, the children had stopped playing to stare at them, and Beatrice realized they had an audience. Sarah appeared on the porch behind them, wiping her hands on her apron and grinning like a woman who had just won a bet. About time, Sarah said dryly. I was beginning to think I would have to lock you two in a room together until you figured out what everyone else could already see. Harrison laughed, a sound Beatrice had heard so rarely it made her heart swell. You knew? Of course I knew. Thomas knew. The children knew. I am pretty sure even the horses knew. You two have been dancing around each other for months. I am just glad you finally did something about it. Thomas emerged from the barn, drawn by the commotion, and when he saw Harrison and Beatrice sitting close together with their hands still clasped, a slow smile spread across his face. Well, brother, it is about time. Congratulations to you both. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of celebration and planning. Sarah immediately began discussing wedding arrangements, insisting they could have the ceremony right there at the ranch in a month's time. Thomas broke out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and the cowboys who came in for dinner raised their glasses in toasts to the happy couple. The children were thrilled at the prospect of a wedding, especially Emma, who declared she wanted to be a flower girl and wear her best dress. Through it all, Harrison never let go of Beatrice's hand, as if afraid she might disappear if he did not maintain physical contact. And Beatrice found she did not mind at all. She had spent so long being alone, had convinced herself she would always be alone. The fact that this good man loved her and wanted to build a life with her felt like a miracle she had done nothing to deserve, but would treasure every day for the rest of her life. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Beatrice slipped out onto the porch to look at the stars. The night was cool but not cold, and the sky was so clear she felt like she could see forever. She was standing there lost in thought when Harrison joined her, draping a blanket around her shoulders. Could not sleep? He asked. Too much to think about, Beatrice admitted. This morning I woke up believing I would spend the rest of my life as hired help, content but alone. Tonight I'm engaged to be married. It feels like a dream. Harrison wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest with a sigh of contentment. If it is a dream, I do not want to wake up. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the blanket, watching the stars wheel overhead. Beatrice thought about the path that had led her here, from Missouri to Washington, from a burning cabin to this ranch, from certain death to a love she had never expected. It had not been an easy road, but standing here in Harrison's arms, she would not change a single step of the journey. What are you thinking? Harrison asked, his breath warm against her ear. I am thinking that the best thing that ever happened to me was that cabin catching fire, Beatrice said. Which is a terrible thing to say, I know. But it is true. If it had not burned, I would never have met you. I would still be out there alone, probably not surviving the winter. Instead, I am here with you, about to start a whole new life. Harrison tightened his arms around her. I thank God for that fire every day, even though the thought of what could have happened to you still gives me nightmares. When I saw you in the snow, so small and helpless, screaming into the storm, I felt something in my chest crack open. I did not know it at the time, but that was the moment I started falling for you. You looked so fierce, still fighting, even though you had every reason to give up. I knew right then that you were someone special, someone worth saving. Beatrice turned in his arms so she could see his face. We saved each other, I think. You pulled me out of the snow, but I pulled you out of whatever lonely place you had been living in since your heart was broken. We both needed rescuing. Harrison kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and finally her lips. I love you, Beatrice Grantham. I am going to spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes to me. I could never regret it, Beatrice promised. You are the best man I have ever known, Harrison Yates, and I am the luckiest woman alive. The month leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm, enlisting Beatrice's help to sew a wedding dress from white fabric Thomas ordered special from town. It was simple but beautiful, with lace at the collar and cuffs that Sarah had been saving for years. Beatrice spent hours fitting and stitching, hardly able to believe she would soon wear it to marry the man she loved. Harrison was equally busy, working with Thomas to build a small cabin on the far edge of the ranch property where he and Beatrice would live after the wedding. It was not large, just 3 rooms and a porch, but Harrison built it with his own hands, and every board he laid seemed to be an expression of love. Beatrice visited the construction site whenever she could, watching the cabin take shape and imagining their life together within its walls. The wedding took place on a perfect day in late May, with the sun shining and wildflowers blooming across the prairie. Sarah had transformed the yard in front of the main house into something magical, with chairs borrowed from neighbors and flowers everywhere. People came from miles around to witness the ceremony: ranchers and their families, cowboys who worked neighboring spreads, and townspeople from Walla Walla who had gotten to know Beatrice during her occasional trips to buy supplies. Beatrice walked down the makeshift aisle on Thomas's arm, feeling like she was floating rather than walking. Harrison waited for her at the end, wearing a new suit that Sarah had somehow convinced him to buy, and the look on his face when he saw her made tears spring to her eyes. She had never felt more beautiful or more loved than she did in that moment. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through the area, and Beatrice barely heard the words. All she could focus on was Harrison's hand holding hers, his gray eyes locked on her face, the slight tremor in his voice when he said his vows. When the preacher finally pronounced them man and wife, and Harrison kissed her, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. There was food and music and dancing, with cowboys taking turns playing fiddles and guitars while couples swirled across the yard. Harrison proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, and he swept Beatrice around until she was dizzy with laughter and joy. Sarah cried happy tears, and Thomas got pleasantly drunk, and the children ran wild until they fell asleep in piles wherever they happened to collapse. As the party finally wound down and the last guest departed, Harrison scooped Beatrice up in his arms despite her laughing protests that she was perfectly capable of walking. He carried her all the way to their new cabin, not setting her down until they were inside with the door closed behind them. The cabin was still mostly empty, containing only a bed, a table with 2 chairs, and the pot-bellied stove Harrison had installed last week. But it was theirs, bought and paid for with Harrison's savings and his labor, and it was perfect. That night they came together as husband and wife, and Beatrice discovered depths of passion and tenderness she had not known existed. Harrison was gentle with her, patient and caring, and when they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, she felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. This was what she had been searching for, this connection with another soul that made her feel seen and known and cherished. "I love you, Mrs. Yates," Harrison murmured against her hair. Beatrice smiled into the darkness. "I love you too, Mr. Yates. Now and always." The months that followed their wedding were the happiest of Beatrice's life. She and Harrison settled into their cabin and into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Beatrice continued to help Sarah with the household when she was needed, but she also threw herself into making their little cabin a real home. She sewed curtains for the windows and planted a garden behind the house. She learned to cook on the cantankerous stove and to keep the cabin clean despite the dust that seemed to creep in through every crack. Harrison worked as hard as ever, but now he had something to come home to at the end of each day, and Beatrice could see the difference it made in him. The wariness that had always shadowed his eyes began to fade, replaced by contentment and joy. He laughed more, smiled more, and sometimes Beatrice would catch him watching her with an expression of wonder, as if he could not quite believe she was real. Summer turned to fall, and fall to winter again. This time, when the snow came, Beatrice was safe and warm in their cabin with Harrison beside her, and the blizzards that raged outside held no terror for her. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, she would tell Harrison about that terrible night when her cabin burned, and he would hold her close and promise she would never face such danger alone again. In the spring, nearly a year after their wedding, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She told Harrison one evening over dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her, and then his eyes filled with tears, and he pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that stole her breath. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, though she could already see the answer written all over his face. Happy does not even begin to cover it. I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I do not even have words. A baby, Beatrice. Our baby. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, despite Beatrice's lingering fear that something would go wrong. Sarah was a wealth of knowledge and support, having been through it 3 times herself, and the other ranch women were equally generous with advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Harrison was almost comically protective, treating Beatrice like she was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. She found it endearing even when it drove her crazy. Their son was born on a clear October morning, arriving with a lusty cry that announced to the world he had no intention of being overlooked. Harrison was present for the birth, holding Beatrice's hand and whispering encouragement even as he looked ready to faint. When the midwife placed the baby in his arms for the first time, Beatrice watched her strong, capable cowboy husband dissolve into tears as he stared down at the tiny red face of his son. They named him Henry, after Beatrice's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he became the center of their universe. Harrison proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Henry when he fussed at night and singing him lullabies in a voice that was surprisingly tuneful. Beatrice had never loved her husband more than she did watching him care for their son with such tender attention. The years that followed brought more changes and more blessings. 2 years after Henry's birth, Beatrice gave birth to twin daughters, Grace and Hope, who filled the cabin with chaos and laughter. Harrison built an addition onto the cabin to accommodate their growing family, and Beatrice planted more gardens and learned to manage a household that seemed to expand every time she turned around. The triple bar continued to thrive, and Harrison's position there grew more secure with each passing season. Thomas eventually promoted him to assistant foreman, a role that came with more responsibility and better pay. It allowed Harrison to add to their savings, and he talked sometimes about the future, about maybe buying their own small ranch someday when the children were grown. But Beatrice was content exactly where they were, surrounded by family and friends, part of a community that had taken her in and made her one of their own. Sarah became the sister Beatrice had never had, and their children grew up together more like cousins than friends. The 2 women spent countless hours together, sharing the work and the joys of raising families on the frontier. Thomas remained a steady presence, a good foreman, and a better friend, and his respect for Harrison never wavered even as his younger brother's family expanded. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Beatrice with a trip into Walla Walla. They left the children with Sarah and Thomas and rode into town together, something they had not done alone in years. Harrison took her to the nicest hotel in town, where they had dinner in the restaurant and spent the night in a real bed with fresh linens. It was a luxury they could finally afford, and Beatrice treasured every moment of it. As they lay together that night, Harrison pulled her close and kissed her temple. "Do you ever think about that night I found you in the snow?" "Sometimes," Beatrice admitted. "Usually when I am feeling particularly grateful for what we have." "Why do you ask?" "Because I was just thinking that everything good in my life started that night. If I had not decided to check on that fire, if I had not heard you screaming, if I had been even 5 minutes later getting to you, none of this would exist. We would not exist. And I cannot imagine a world where I never knew you, never loved you, never built this life with you." Beatrice turned to face him, her hand coming up to cup his bearded cheek. I think we were meant to find each other, Harrison. Maybe not in the way it happened, and I would not wish that terror on anyone. But somehow, some way, I believe we were always supposed to end up together. You are my home, you and our children, and this life we have built. Everything else is just details. Harrison kissed her then, deep and sweet, and they made love with the unhurried passion of two people who knew they had all the time in the world. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms in the darkness, Beatrice thought about how far she had come from that desperate girl running through the blizzard, screaming into the night. She had lost everything that night, but in losing everything, she had found what really mattered. She had found love and family, and a place to belong. She had found Harrison. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that make up any life. There were good years when the cattle prices were high and the weather was mild, and there were hard years when drought or disease threatened the herd. There were births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. Through it all, Harrison and Beatrice faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing season. Their children grew into fine young people. Henry became a skilled horseman who dreamed of breeding horses rather than herding cattle. Grace showed an early talent for music and spent hours playing the piano Sarah had somehow convinced Thomas to buy. Hope was the wild one, more interested in riding and roping than in anything domestic, and Harrison predicted she would break hearts across the territory before she was through. As Harrison and Beatrice entered their 40s, they found themselves in the strange position of being the older generation at the Triple Bar. Thomas had retired from active ranch work after a bad fall from a horse, and Harrison had taken over as foreman. It was a responsibility he took seriously, managing the cowboys and the cattle with the same quiet competence he brought to everything in his life. On a winter evening, much like the one when they first met, Harrison and Beatrice sat together on the porch of their cabin, wrapped in blankets and watching the snow fall. The children were all inside doing homework or chores, and for a moment it was just the two of them in the peaceful silence of the winter night. "Do you ever regret it?" Harrison asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean. Staying out here instead of going back east or finding a life in town." Beatrice looked at him in genuine surprise. "Where is this coming from? After 20 years of marriage and 3 children, you are asking me this now?" Harrison shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "I was just thinking about everything you gave up to be with me. You could have had an easier life, a softer life." Beatrice took his hand and laced their fingers together. "Listen to me, Harrison Yates. I gave up nothing that mattered and gained everything I ever wanted. I have a husband who loves me, and children who make me proud, and a home I helped build with my own hands. I have friends who are like family, and work that gives me purpose. What more could any woman want? So no, I do not regret a single day of our life together. Not one." Harrison pulled her close, and she nestled against his side with a contented sigh. They sat like that for a long time, watching the snow pile up in the yard and listening to the muffled sounds of their children inside the cabin. This was peace, Beatrice thought. This was happiness. Not the absence of difficulty or struggle, but the presence of love strong enough to weather any storm. The years continued their steady march, and before Beatrice knew it, she was 50 years old, and her children were grown. Henry had married a girl from town and was running his own horse breeding operation on land he leased from the Triple Bar. Grace had married a school teacher and moved to Spokane, where she taught piano lessons and raised 2 children of her own. Hope, true to her wild nature, had shocked everyone by becoming one of the first female ranch managers in the territory, running a spread down near the Oregon border with skill and determination. Harrison's hair had gone completely gray, and Beatrice's dark curls were streaked with silver. They moved a little slower now, their joints protesting the years of hard work in the harsh climate. But they were healthy and active, still working the ranch alongside a new generation of cowboys who looked to Harrison for guidance the way he had once looked to Thomas. On their 30th anniversary, Their children surprised them with a party that brought together people from all over the territory. Friends and family filled the main house and spilled out into the yard, and Beatrice was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and respect for the life she and Harrison had built together. Sarah and Thomas were there, older now, but still sharp and engaged, their own grandchildren running wild with Henry's kids. The current owner of the Triple Bar, Thomas's son who had inherited the ranch, gave a speech about Harrison's decades of faithful service and presented him with a gold watch. But the best moment came late in the evening, when the crowd had thinned and Beatrice and Harrison found themselves alone on the porch where he had first proposed to her all those years ago. The May night was warm and soft, and the stars overhead seemed close enough to touch. 30 years, Harrison said, shaking his head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I pulled you out of that snow. Other times it feels like we have been together forever, like there was never a time when you were not part of my life. Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder. I know exactly what you mean. I cannot even remember what my life was like before you. It is all just a blur until the moment you found me and everything came into focus. They stood together in comfortable silence, and Beatrice thought about all the moments that had brought them to this point. The fear and the joy, the struggles and the triumphs, the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones. It had not always been easy, this life they had chosen. There had been times when money was tight and times when worry kept them up at night. There had been illnesses and injuries, disappointments and losses. But through it all, they had each other, and that had made all the difference. I would do it all again, Harrison said softly as if reading her thoughts. Every hard day, every challenge, every moment of doubt. I would go through it all again just to end up here with you. Beatrice turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life and then given her a reason to live it fully. His face was lined now, marked by decades of sun and wind and hard work. But his eyes were still the same gray she had first seen through the snow and darkness, and they still looked at her with the same love and devotion that had never wavered in 30 years. I love you, Harrison Yates, she said. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Beatrice Yates. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. They kissed then, a kiss that held 30 years of love and partnership and commitment. And as they stood together under the stars, wrapped in each other's arms, Beatrice thought about the girl she had been, running through the blizzard away from her burning cabin, screaming into the snow with no hope of rescue. That girl could never have imagined this future, this beautiful life built on a foundation of love and trust and mutual respect. But she had survived that terrible night, and in surviving, she had found everything worth living for. The story could have ended there, but life has a way of continuing, even when the major chapters seem complete. Harrison and Beatrice lived on at the Triple Bar for many more years, watching their grandchildren grow and eventually welcoming great-grandchildren into the world. They grew old together gracefully, their love only deepening with time and familiarity. On a cold January evening when Beatrice was 70 years old, she and Harrison sat by the fire in their cabin, holding hands as they had done countless times before. Outside, a blizzard raged, much like the one that had brought them together nearly 50 years earlier. But inside they were warm and safe, surrounded by a lifetime of memories and mementos. Do you hear that wind? Harrison asked, his voice still strong despite his age. Reminds me of the night I found you. Beatrice smiled and squeezed his hand. I was just thinking the same thing. Except this time, we are safe inside together, instead of out there in the storm. Thank God for that, Harrison said fervently. I never want to feel that terror again, thinking I might not find you in time, that I might lose you before I even knew you. But you did find me, Beatrice reminded him. You have always found me, Harrison. Even on the days when I felt lost, you were there to guide me home. They sat together listening to the storm, content in the silence and in each other's company. After so many years together, words were often unnecessary. They had learned to communicate in glances and touches, in the comfortable rhythms of shared life. As the fire burned low and the hour grew late, Harrison helped Beatrice to bed, a nightly ritual that had become more necessary as their bodies aged. They lay down together under the quilts Beatrice had made over the years, each one telling a story of their life together. Harrison wrapped his arms around her, as he had done every night for 50 years, and Beatrice fitted herself against him with the ease of long practice. "Good night, my love," Harrison whispered into the darkness. "Good night," Beatrice whispered back. "I will see you in the morning." And she did see him in the morning, and the morning after that, and for many more mornings to come. Their love story, which had begun so dramatically in fire and ice, continued in the quiet, everyday moments that make up a life well lived. They grew old together, supporting each other through the aches and pains of aging bodies, celebrating the achievements of their children and grandchildren, and never taking for granted the gift they had been given that winter night so long ago. When Harrison finally passed away at the age of 84, it was peacefully in his sleep with Beatrice holding his hand. She grieved deeply for the loss of her partner, her best friend, the love of her life. But she did not regret a single moment of their time together. He had given her 52 years of love and devotion, and she had given him the same in return. That was more than most people ever got, and she knew how blessed she had been. Beatrice lived for another 3 years after Harrison's death, spending her final days surrounded by family and friends, telling stories of the old days and passing on the wisdom she had gained over a long and full life. She spoke often of the night the cabin burned, of how Harrison had ridden through the blizzard to save her, of how that terrible night had been the beginning of the greatest blessing of her life. When her time finally came, Beatrice went peacefully, a smile on her face and her children holding her hands. Her last words were of Harrison, saying she could see him waiting for her and that she was ready to go home. And perhaps she did go home in the end, back to the arms of the man who had saved her life and taught her what it meant to truly live. The story of Beatrice and Harrison became a legend at the Triple Bar, passed down through generations as an example of true love found in the most unlikely circumstances. Their little cabin still stood on the edge of the property, lovingly maintained by their descendants as a testament to what their great-grandparents had built together. And on winter nights, when the wind howled and the snow fell thick, people would tell the story of how a cowboy rode through a blizzard to save a woman screaming in the snow, and how that act of courage and compassion had led to a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, because in the end, that is what we leave behind. Not possessions or achievements, but the love we shared and the lives we touched. Beatrice and Harrison understood that, and they built their life accordingly. They worked hard and loved deeply, and faced every challenge together with courage and grace. They raised good children who became good people, who raised good children of their own. They were part of a community, contributing their labor and their loyalty and their friendship to something larger than themselves. And it all started with a burning cabin, a blizzard, and a cowboy who refused to ride past someone in need. From those desperate beginnings grew something beautiful and lasting, proof that even in the darkest moments, hope and love can flourish if we are brave enough to reach for them. Beatrice reached for hope that night when she ran from the flames, and Harrison reached for compassion when he rode toward her screams. Together they built something that outlasted them both, a legacy of love that would inspire generations yet to come. That is the power of love, Beatrice would have said if anyone asked, not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, though those have their place, but the everyday choice to show up for each other, to work together toward common goals, to forgive mistakes and celebrate victories, and support each other through the hard times. That is what makes a love story worth telling. That is what makes a life worth living. And so the story ends where it began, with fire and snow and a woman crying out into the darkness. But this time the darkness holds no terror, only the peaceful rest of a life well lived. and a love that endured through every trial. Beatrice Grantham Yates lived and loved and left the world better than she found it. And in the end, what more could anyone ask for than that?